Good morning to dear colleagues and friends in East Asia, and good evening to dear colleagues and friends in North America. My name is Wang Jianbao, Associate Researcher of Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University. I'm also Director of Research Center for Humanities and Business Ethics at the Chongqing Graduate School of Business. I'm very glad to be here as a moderator for a series cyber lectures on spiritual humanism organized by IIHS, Peking University. Let me start with 4 very simple notions for a comprehensive and integrated spiritual humanism, in which 4 dimensions of the commonly shared human experience, self, community, earth, and heaven, are brought together to define the highest manifestation of human flourishing, the integration of the body, heart, mind, soul, and spirit of the self, fruitful interaction of the self and community, like home, neighborhood, village, city, province, nation, world, and beyond, especially in this pandemic situation. A sustainable and harmonious relationship between the human species and nature, like the animal kingdom, plants, trees, rocks, mountains, rivers, and air. And 4th, mutuality between the human heart, mind, and the will of heaven. So spiritual humanism is an emerging discourse developed by IIHS under the leadership of Professor Tu Min. He founded this institute in 2008, and we started our studies in 2010 with our office at the campus nearby Women Lake. Today is my big honor to introduce 2 distinguished scholars for this lecture. The topic of this time lecture is culture as a Confucian problem. I took the liberty to translate into Chinese, 斯文在儒. Our speaker is Peter BOL. He is Charles Caswell Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. Professor BOL's research is centered on the history of China's cultural elites at the national and the local levels from the 7th to the 17th century. He's the author of This Culture of Ours, Intellectual Transitions in Tang and Song China, Neo-Confucianism in History, Localizing Learning, Local Literati and National Culture is forthcoming, and various journal articles in Chinese, Japanese, and English. He led Harvard's university-wide effort to establish support for geospatial analysis in teaching and research. In 2005, he was named the first director of the Center for Geographic Analysis. As vice provost from 2013 to 2018, he was responsible for Harvard X, the Harvard Initiative in Learning and Teaching. He personally, together with William Purvey, teaches China X, one of the Harvard X course. For this China Biographic Database project, an online relational database currently of 420,000 historical figures that is being expanded. Our second distinguished scholar is Professor Ni Peimin. He is a tenured professor, Department of Philosophy, Grand Valley State University. Mr. Ni is also my mentor. He is former Executive Vice Director, Institute of Advanced Humanistic Studies, Peking University. So now I will hand my job to Professor Ni. Please.
For the introduction. And indeed, we are so fortunate to have Professor Peter BOL to be with us to give us this presentation. I had the fortune to work at the Institute of Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University. It was at that time I got to have the chance to meet Professor BOL. And last February, late February, we together was attending a conference hosted by Professor Du Weiming. And that was just at the early stage of the pandemic. And it was an interesting and adventurous kind of encounter. Now, today, Professor BOL's talk, the topic of Professor BOL's talk is Culture as a Confucian Problem. And Jian Bao has translated, as he said, as 斯文在儒. This is a really thought-provoking translation. I don't think I can do better than that. But I would like to explain a little bit about here the word 在儒. Here, 在儒 doesn't mean that culture is only residing at Confucianism, not at other schools of thought. As I understand, Professor Peter BOL is going to talk about how culture is a problem for Confucianism, how Confucianism handles, deals with, understands culture. So it is here this word 在 means more like 对儒家而言，对儒家而言，文化意味着什么？So to avoid misleading understanding of this translation, I would add this brief understanding of my own. So I don't want to take more time. Please let us welcome Professor Peter BOL for his presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Wang Jianbao, and thank you, Ni Peimin. It's a great honor to be speaking to you today and all of you who are on this Zoom call. It's an honor to speak at an Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Beida because it was founded by Professor Du, who I was a colleague of here at Harvard for many years, and when he left a great hole in this university. Many years ago, when I began to study Chinese history, we were told that Confucianism and Confucian studies were a dead historical object. And Professor Du is one of the people in the West who showed that it was a living tradition. And I share his interest in Confucianism and China's spiritual and intellectual traditions. But I come to this as an historian. My initial interest in China was in Chinese politics and political history. I had no intention of working on doing research on thought, doing any research on philosophy. I was not interested in philosophy. I was not interested in literature. And I ended up, in fact, spending a great deal of time thinking about philosophy and thinking about literature. But when I was a graduate student, I spent around 3.5 years studying the Sishu Wujing in Taiwan with an old teacher, Yu Lao. And I began to realize that if we want to think about how people with power make the choices they make, we needed to understand how they understood the world. What was real to them? What did they think their choices were? And so, because my interest, historical interest, was in the transition from Tang to Sung, from the early empire to the later empire, I ended up studying Neo-Confucianism, 宋明理学, 道学, from Tang to Ming, because I saw that it was a central issue in the transition from the early imperial period to the later imperial period. And I was convinced there was a connection between this new Confucianism that appeared and the transformation of Chinese political elite from the great Shizu, the great clans of Tang, to the Difang Shiren, the local literati of Southern Song. Now, in my talk today, I will reach back to Confucius, but other than that, I will largely focus my talk on middle period history, Tang Song Yuanming. And the problem I want to think about, and I have thought about for a long time, is the hostility, the antagonism between philosophical Confucians, Daoxue Confucians, Lixue Confucians, and literary scholars, people who became famous for their Wenzhang and their Wenxue. Right? Now, in this talk, I'm to use things I've written about, from the beginning of my career, but also more recently in a book that's forthcoming on intellectual history at the local level called Localizing Learning, my current work on the late 15th century, leading into Wang Yanming. Now, let me begin with Confucianism, with culture as a Confucian problem. And I will share my screen as a way of showing the Chinese texts I'm talking about. So what are the words that are involved in this? I don't think culture is a very good translation, but in Chinese, we recognize that these words, wen, si wen, wenzhang, wenxue, wenjiao, are somehow related to each other, right? Culture is not an adequate translation of any of these words, but literature is not an adequate translation either. Moreover, the meaning of these terms changed over time. What Confucius meant by one and what people in the Ming Dynasty mean by one are not necessarily the same thing. Instead, I want us to think that of these set of terms as related to each other, having to do with things that are on the surface, appearances, patterns, proper forms, writing, texts, proper writing, literary writing, and even the idea of civil, wenzhi, right, wenzhang versus military government. Because after all, civil government is a government that relies on the pen, relies on writing, that operates by requiring adherence to proper forms, to shared forms, versus military violence. And so there are two questions I think we need to ask. Why do Confucians see wen, wenzhang, wenxue as a problem? And what is the justification for one, for this idea, this concept of wen, wenxue, wenzhang, that makes it so problematic? Now, in addressing these questions and thinking about answers to them, I'm guided by something Du Ming said many years ago to a group of students at the Harvard Divinity School. He was giving them a lecture and he invited me to attend. And he looked out at the students and he said, "You are all Neo-Confucians." Neo-Confucians Daoxue, right? "You are all Neo-Confucians. You just don't know it yet." That was a very interesting comment. I forget what he said for the rest of what he said, but that one comment struck me as profoundly true. If we share Neo-Confucian assumptions, we are all Neo-Confucians. We just don't know it yet. And as Zhu Xi in the 12th century explained to anyone who would listen, sorry. As Zhu Xi explained to anyone who would listen, right? If you have this body, then you have this human nature. And if you have this human nature, then you have this li, this principle, this coherence. 人之生就此心，即有此心，则有此性。有此性，则有此理, right? Indeed. Now, we look at Confucius and try to say, well, what is the issue about one in the Analects of Confucius? I don't think we can say exactly what the word means, but we can see the area of meaning it is constructed by contrast to other words. For example, when Confucius says this, when you're at home, then you are filial. When you go out, then you're brotherly. You are respectful and trustworthy. You love the masses and are close to people who are humane. And when in your conduct, and when you're able to do all these things and you have strength left over, then you can learn 学文, right? Which Zhu Xi interpreted as 夫子之兆人，以德行为先，文学为后. Well, it's probably pretty right. I'm not sure what Confucius meant, if he meant 文学 or not at this point, but clearly there's a difference for him. And 学文 is something that's secondary to 行 and to 德行, to ethical conduct. The second meaning, one is something that an individual can acquire, but it doesn't provide adequate guidance. So Confucius say, 博学于文，约之以礼, right? And so between those two terms, 博学于文，约之以礼, there really is a word, are, right? But you can broaden your learning in one, but if you don't restrain it, tie it together with rights, then you will go wrong, right? It's okay to learn broadly, but it must be tied together with rights if you are to avoid going to a mistake. So in that sense, 博学于文 does not provide ethical guidance, does not provide moral guidance. There's another way of dividing things up. This is the famous 十者, right? The 10 followers of Confucius, divided up according to 四课, the 4 fields. 德行, right? 颜回 and others. 言语, 在我, 正史, right? And 文学 with 自由 and 自洽. Now, again, we're not exactly certain what 文学 means of this, but we know it's not 德行, we know it's not 正史, and we know it's not 言语. Interestingly, by the way, in Sung, right, 言语 will disappear. Even though people talk about the 四课, really they're only going to be 三课, right? 德行 正史 and 文学, with 文学 being last. So it's one area, 文学, whatever it means, is one area in which Confucians can, or followers of Confucius, can gain fame, can gain a reputation. And that remains true into later times as well. And this notion that there are different areas, right, that are within the scope of what Confucius is interested in, remains true for later dynasties. And then we have this famous passage, right, which is when Confucius was trapped at the state of Kuang. He says, Wen Wang Ji Bo, Wen Bu Zai Ci Hu. King Wen, the founder of the Zhou dynasty, is gone. But Wen, again, whatever it means, is here with me. 天子将丧是文也，是后者不欲于是文也。天子为丧是文也，况人其如于何? Right? So if heaven was going to let this Siwen perish, then somebody like myself born later would not be able to participate in it. And since I participate in it, thus I know that heaven has not given it up yet. What worries do I have? No one can threaten me. I am protected in some sense. I have a value that transcends the moment. But in this passage, we actually see two things going on. One is King Wen, who's an historical figure. Many of you will remember the poem in the Shijing, Wen Wang, right? Which ends with telling people, take King Wen as your model, right? So history, in the sense of antiquity, not just Gudai, but Sandai Zhigu, right? The Xian Wang, right? The Sheng Wang, right? Wen Wang is one of them. That's a kind of antiquity that's a model, a human model. But there's also another basis, which is heaven. And those two things, right? The historical and the heaven or natural, or Tian, and then later times understood as Tiandi, right? These will be, right, the two foundations of thinking about values. And in this passage, Confucius, in part because he wants to make the connection to King Wen, has used this term Siwen. When Zhu Xi sees this, he's not happy. He's not happy. He says, what's Wen? Wen is Dao Zhi Xianzhe. Wen is simply the manifestation of the way, of the Dao. What does it mean? Well, it means Li Yue Zhidu. It means rites and music and systems. Why does Confucius not say Dao, but says Wen? Well, Zhu Xi doesn't have an answer for that. So he dismisses it. He says, oh, he's just being polite. He's being humble. But I don't think Confucius was a humble guy, right? I think that Confucius said Wen because he actually meant it, right? But what he meant is still open to question. Now, who owns this term, Siwen? It can be claimed by poets. Wang Tingjian, the great poet of the 11th century, said he was Sanyu Siwen. Su Shi did as well. Wang Anshi did as well, right? So if you claim Siwen, you're also claiming to be part of a tradition that goes back to the Zhou dynasty at least. As we can see for Zhu Xi, there's a problem here. Now, in the time after Confucius, Confucius came to be seen in a new way, not as Mencius saw him, not as Mengzi saw him, but much more as Sima Qian saw him, which was the editor of texts. Now, my view of Confucius is that Confucius was a revolutionary teacher, a disturbing figure, a disruptive figure, a people who taught individuals how to learn for themselves, who taught Weiji Zhixue, right? Learning for oneself. And so the later Confucius, the Han Confucius, who's reduced to being an editor of the classics, was made the father of a textual tradition. Right? And there's much more we could say of that, but I won't. The other thing I would point to is that in the medieval period, in Weijin Nanbeichao, we often see the term wenjiao, and that comes up later times as well. And what is this word wenjiao? Because it's used sometimes to mean the same thing as rujiao. Right? Why would you say rujiao is wenjiao, or ruxue could be called wenxue? Because again, Juxi would never accept that. Later Neo-Confucians would never accept that. Well, I think we can understand that if we see that in the medieval period, there's, and perhaps earlier too, there's certain assumptions that are being made, right? That the self, what's in you, can't be well defined. Things happen to you, experience happens, and you respond. And your response reveals your character. So your xing, so to speak, at that point, is your personal character. And what does wenjiao do? Wenjiao teaches us that there are proper ways to respond. In some sense, wenjiao is all about li, ritual, right? Because there are right ways to respond. And if people don't learn the right ways to respond to what happens to them, then the world will go into chaos, right? So it's learning proper behavior and ritual as a means of socialization. But at the same time, in the medieval period, in Weijin Nanbeichao, when this was happening, right? People began to see that literary men, literary figures, writers, right, were becoming increasingly prominent in public life. And in many ways more interesting than people who studied the classics. And the classics were seen by many as being inadequate for their times. And so that's when we see the appearance of new kinds of biographies, right? In the early histories, there's only one group biography for scholars, and that's the Rulin. But in the medieval period, we see the Rulin being matched by Wenyuan Zhuan, which are biographies devoted to literary figures. And thus we see the division in the world of the political elite emerging between two views of learning, a Ru view of learning and a Wen view of learning, a classical view of learning grounded in the study of the classics and a literary view of learning. Right? Learning one as literary writing really appears in this medieval period. And it's interesting because in some sense, it's very much like ritual. Just as ritual constrains the way people behave, so does one, because of its different genres, its different tea, right, constrain individual expression. Right? In some sense, to learn to write well is to learn how you should speak in response to the things that happen to you in the world, in response to your experience. But in contrast to ritual, which erases the individuality of the person, wenjiang, as a way of expressing the self, allows for individual differentiated expression. Now, by the time we get to the Song Dynasty, it's clear that literary writing has become so important that it becomes one of the ways in which, a preeminent way in which people are chosen for public office through the civil service examination system. People talk about how old the civil service examination system, the Keju, is. But in fact, it really becomes the truly important mode of elite selection only in the late 10th century in the Song. Right? And when it's used to staff the government, it has two aspects, two tracks. One is called the Zhuke, which is mainly examinations, testing, memorization of the classics. And the other is the Jinshi, which tests literary composition. The Jinshi is more prestigious, but there are just as many people who do the Zhuke, who do the memorization exams. That will change, by the way, in the 1070s under Wang Anshi, and they will abolish the memorization exams and only have the literary composition exam, but then focused on the classics. Now, let me move right away to Cheng Yi and Cheng Hao, the Cheng brothers. And this is Cheng Yi's famous essay written when he was 19 years old, 19岁, right? 言之所好何学? And his answer to that, right, is 学之圣人之道. His learning was the learning the way to reach sagehood. And he went further and said, if you don't look for this, right, in yourself, if you don't seek this in yourself, but seek it outside, if you seek it with learning a lot and remembering a lot, if you seek it through being good at literature, being a good writer, and making your words fancy, then very few people will reach the Tao. But that's what people in his time, he thought, did, most people. And that's what made him different. And Cheng Yi goes on, and this is what gets us at the heart, I think, of Neo-Confucianism, of Daoxue, is that he posits that there's a kind of knowledge that is inherent in the self. He says, 闻见之智，非德行之智，无找物之知之，非内也. So this knowledge that we gain by hearing and seeing is not the knowledge of one's moral nature. It's something you know because things interact with things. It's external, right? What's today, when people today were called knowing a lot of stuff, 博物, 多能, with many abilities, that's this. This is 见闻知之, right? It's 德行之知 is not part of that. Right? So now we have the claim, right, that there's a kind of knowledge that really leaves one zhang, one xue outside of the picture. He recognizes, Cheng Yi recognizes, that the kind of learning he's interested in, right, is very different from two kinds of learning. So he says, 故知学之，今知学之散，一端不逾也. Let's not, he says, there are three kinds of learners today. And we ignore Buddhism and Taoism. There's 文章之学, right? There's 深固之学, and there's 儒者之学. So, now one moment, 深固之学 is simply the study of the classics. That was traditional 儒者之学. And Cheng Yi is saying, no, it's not. The study, the learning of Wenzhang, the learning of the classics, these are not what it means to do true learning. Why? Because the Ruzhi Zhixue is the way in which you chu Dao, right? You pursue the Dao. And so now we have the beginning of the concept of Daoxue. And Cheng Yi in his later in life begins to use this word Daoxue, and Zhu Xi much more so. But clearly Daoxue is set opposite Wenxue. Wenxue not in the sense only of literature, but of learning texts, whether it's classics or Wenzhang, right? Spending your time learning texts, doing Jianwen Zhizhi, doing Boxue Changji. And he's asked the question, Cheng Yi is, 作文海盗佛. And he says, yeah, it does. It harms the way. Why does it harm the way? Well, clearly, if true knowledge, if moral knowledge is internal to the self, if knowledge that allows you to pursue the way is internal to the self, is to be sought in the self, then something that leads you to pursue external surfaces, appearances, is an obstacle to your self-cultivation, to your knowledge, to your learning. As he says, if you're going to do one, you have to be serious about it. You have to draw the, right? If you want to be, successful, if you want to be skillful, you have to really pay attention. But if you're going to really pay attention, then your will, your purpose is going to be contained within that effort to be successful in writing. And how can you share in the greatness of heaven and earth? And he quotes the famous line from the Shujing, Wang Wu Sang Zhi, right? When you play with things, you lose your will. And he says, Wei Wen, doing one, is playing with things. And yet, here is the conundrum. And we have around 3 different ways in the Yishu of Chengyi. We have this final set of sentences comes up again, at least 3 times, each time formulated slightly differently. The students heard it slightly differently, or he said it differently at different times. But what he says is this: today, the only thing we have with which to yang, qixin, to cultivate our minds, right, is yili. But there are other things that would have been possible. Wei ci, right? Wei yi and sirang, yang qi ti. There are things you could do to cultivate your body, right? Proper modes of behavior and politeness. There are wenjiang and wucai. There are things to cultivate your eyes. There's sounds to cultivate your ears. There's dance to cultivate your blood, your circulation. Just wei bei. None of them are complete anymore. So what Chengyi is saying is that in the past, in antiquity, it was possible that all these jianwenzhi, all these external things that you could hear and see and do, right? These were a way of cultivating yourself, but they don't work anymore. They don't work for us today. The only things that's left is intellectual, right? Is to cultivate your mind and heart with ili, with moral principles, with ideas. So that's the big change that's happened. So he doesn't deny the possibility that culture could work as a way of cultivating people. But in the end, he says, it doesn't work today. Today, we need to do something else. Well, what is Chengyi and Chenghao? And let me actually go back to this. I don't know who's writing on the screen here, but it would be great if you didn't write on the screen. The Chengju tradition is grounding values in a belief that there's a unified, coherent, but dynamic system based on the creative processes of heaven and earth. Right? There's a belief that this coherent unity exists in each of us equally, and in fact, in all things. This coherent unity, the word they use for it is qianli, right? And it's basically our xing. But it's not only our xing, it's the xing of every single thing in the universe. And it's the totality and the unity of li, the coherence and integration of all principles and patterns, right? That we have endowed within us. Right? So the process of learning in this school of thought is the process of becoming aware of this coherent unity that's in us and being guided by that as we respond to things that we experience. And a belief that this can be expressed in all aspects of life. Right? Not only that every single human being can express this, can realize this in practice. Well, how can they realize this in practice? They can realize this in practice through their deshing, through their ethical conduct, through moral conduct. The problem with Wenxue is that only certain people of special talent can do Wenxue well. Right? But everybody can be a moral person. Everyone can realize their moral nature. And that is a tremendously powerful argument to make. But let's ask the question, what is Changyi arguing against? What is this an alternative to? It's not an alternative to Buddhism in these passages. Right? It's not an alternative to Taoism. It's an alternative to Wenxue. It's an alternative to literary learning. And here, I want to look at a piece that the introduction to Han Yu's Wenji, done by his son-in-law, his Nushu, Li Han. And Li Han says, Wenji Guandao Zhi Qi. Wen is an implement, a tool for threading the Tao, for making the Tao coherent, for tying it all together. Remember this Yi Guanzhi of Confucius, right? Wenji is Guandao Zhi Qi. One is how you Guandao. And then he goes on, Bu Shen Yu Se Dao, if you're not deeply immersed in this Tao, then few people, then you will not, right, reach this Tao. You won't be able to Guandao. And so he talks about the Yao and the Shang of the Yi. He talks about the Chunshou, right? The Chunshou is about affairs. The Shijing has songs. The book of documents and the rights, get rid of the false. All is to be deep in this. And then he says, before Qin and Han, there Qi was Hunan, et cetera, et cetera. And interestingly, who are the people that he cites? Who are the people he cites for this? He says, Sima Qian, Sima Shangru, Dong Zhongshu, Yang Shu, Liu Shang. These were the heroic figures. But then when we get to later Han and the Cao Cao's Wei dynasty and so on, then it becomes all confused, not so good. And it's all, they say they're doing Gu Wen, but actually they're just plagiarizing, imitating. And so Wen and Dao get stopped up.